The hidden elephant in the room that happened to Detroit, Michigan is called mass incarceration and everything related to it. And people are like, what? Where is this coming from? Well, I'll connect the dots for you. First of all, when I say mass incarceration, what am I talking about? I'm talking about between 1970 and the present day, we at the United States came to lock up more people than any other country on the planet. That's China, that's Russia, that's Rwanda. Doesn't matter what country you pick. We incarcerate more people than any other country. This is a graph of just how massive this massive is. You're talking about more than 2 million in prison, more than 7.5 million under correctional control. And you're also talking about juveniles, you're talking about immigration detention. This is a massive, massive pie chart of incarceration, okay? To give you a sense of what this means in Michigan, in that same period since the 1970s, incarceration in Michigan went up 538%. Think about it this way, in 1970, we had about 7,800 people in prison in Michigan. By 2011, we had almost 43,000 people in prison. And today, the amount of people under correctional control is over 120,000 people. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, well, that's interesting. Why does this matter? Well, what I want to suggest to you is it matters for all cities because it's a very racialized incarceration. But it particularly matters to cities that are overwhelmingly black and brown cities. And in the case of Detroit, after the white flight and after the deindustrialization, Detroit was an overwhelmingly black city. So it hit Detroit harder than almost any other full city in the entire country. Now the question is, why? Why is it that over the last 40 years, we started locking up everybody? Why did we start approaching all social problems through the criminal justice system rather than through the social networks that we already used to deal with them? Well, I want to talk a little bit about that. First of all, the way we did it by criminalizing urban space in new ways. That is to say, taking things that had been illegal before and making them much more illegal, which I'll explain. It also meant taking things that already had been, that were never illegal and suddenly making them illegal. In other words, criminalizing spaces in whole new ways. Now you might ask, why? Why did we do this? Why? Well, if you ask most people, they'll tell you a very simple answer. Because of crime. Crime gets out of control, and we have these visuals, right, of the 60s and the 70s and how out of control it was, right? High crime rates. Well, it turns out that one of the interesting things about being a historian is you get to go back and look at things in real time as they happened and ask, is that actually the case? Well, here's something interesting. It turns out we began the war on crime, actually not with Richard Nixon, which you also might expect, but with the presidency of Lyndon Johnson in response to much of the urban uprisings of the 1960s, particularly in 1964 when Harlem and Philadelphia and Rochester all exploded. We began to respond to civil unrest in the North the same way that Southern people, Sheriff Bull Connor and Birmingham and all those guys, the way they had been responding to civil unrest, which is to say, it's not legitimate, it's a bunch of thugs, it's a bunch of criminals, and we need tougher laws, we need to crack down. So it turns out we start this war on crime when the crime rate had not been that low since the teens, which is pretty interesting. And another interesting thing is, if you look at the violent crime rate, by the way, the reason why I always start with homicide is because that's pretty clear, right? You're either dead or you're not. Because it also turns out we start to recharacterize crimes, things that get called different things over time to make the crime rate raise. Particularly, by the way, in the city of Detroit, the police department completely changed the way it categorized crimes under the Kavanaugh administration, and Kavanaugh himself had to say to the public, don't worry, actually the crime rate is not going up, we are changing the way we are counting it. Well, guess why they were changing the way they were counting it? because the war on crime had started in 1965, and there was all kinds of federal dollars to be had if you had a crime problem. That's where people got their flak jackets. That's where people got their helicopters. That's where people got the militarization that they wanted to make stronger police departments. Okay, so the violent crime rate, it turns out, gets catastrophic when we are knee-deep in the war on crime. So we have a lot to unpack here, and what we have to really unpack is what in the world is going on here when we have a country where the crime rate's low, and we're going to make a war on crime, and somehow by doing it, we make things much worse. Well, we do it primarily through the drug war, and nowhere does this play out more viciously than the city of Detroit. And I want to show you these two graphs just because they're not Detroit specific, but they're very, very illuminating. The graph on the left shows drug arrests and indicates very clearly that the majority of people are not arrested for sales, they're arrested for possession, which means we're not locking up Noriega and the drug cartels. It means we are overwhelmingly locking up low-level, very low-level dealers, but mostly people with a drug addiction. So what does this mean? In Detroit, this means in 1980, there were 3,700 arrests for drugs. By 1988, there were 10,000 arrests for drugs, and that just went up and up. But here's what matters. Of those people arrested for drugs in the city of Detroit, 81% of the women were drug users, 68% of the men. So again, this really parallels what we're seeing in this chart on the left. The other thing, though, in this chart on the right, which should horrify you, is look at the racial disparity of these arrests, because any one of us who live in the suburbs know a simple truth, which is that more white people use drugs and sell drugs than black people. It is a fact. But if you look at this marijuana arrest chart, you cannot help but be just staggered by the disparity of the marijuana arrests. And look at that, Wayne County, Michigan is on there. Some of the most staggering actually are Chicago. I could be giving this talk in Chicago as well, because one of the things that happens at the south side of Chicago is the utter devastation of this exact thing I'm talking about. So this is not just a criminalization of space, this is a racialized criminalization of space. And so imagine how heavily this hits a city that very quickly is about 80% and then rising higher African American. So we started with the drug war. We layer it by a sentencing overhaul. That is to say, we give people over the course of the 80s and 90s more time than any other country on the planet, too. So this really matters. It means that if you did something in 1950 and you did it in 1990, you're going to serve dramatically more time for the exact same crime. And what this means is that prisons not only expand, but they get incredibly overcrowded. Michigan's version of this, by the way, is linked to the previous slide about the drug war. Michigan's version of this was to pass something called the 650 lifer law, which is that if you had 650 grams of cocaine, you would get an automatic life sentence. Now, you don't have to be a chemistry major to know that 650 grams of cocaine is actually not very much cocaine. The other thing is that the majority of the people that got nabbed in this were not heavy dealers. Sometimes it was simply by association. So your boyfriend could have the cocaine in your car and you could get an automatic life sentence. But it wasn't just that. It was also just layering on the sentencing in general. Mandatory minimums. The idea that if you did a crime, you got an automatic sentence, and it didn't matter what the extenuating circumstances were. Didn't matter if you were an addict. Didn't matter if you were abused. Didn't matter if you were starving. Didn't matter if you were trying to feed your kids. It didn't matter. You got a mandatory minimum. So in Michigan, and specifically overwhelmingly for Detroiters, what did this mean? Well, it very quickly meant that between 1991 and 2000, the amount of time people served in Michigan increased by 50%. And indeed, by 2009, so not that long ago, people were serving 79% longer time for the exact same crimes that they had been serving in 1990. So in 10 years, 79% increase in the amount of time people spent for the exact same crime. The other thing was we didn't just do this with adults, we did it with children. Michigan and Pennsylvania became the two most notorious of this, locking up children for life sentences without the possibility of parole. Now, eventually, the Supreme Court said you can't do that, although Michigan fought that bitterly to keep the kids in prison forever. And when I say children, let's not mince words here. I do mean children, some of them 10, 11 years old. Michigan has 360 children still serving life sentences. At least now they have the possibility of parole. And so that kind of time led to this also mass incarceration I'm talking about. And while we're speaking of kids, we also have to talk about schools. You might think that there's always been police in schools. That's just kind of the name of it now. You know, you go, you see police in schools everywhere. When did Detroit get its police in schools? In the wake of the uprising of '67. And where in the schools that had a very active civil rights, black power presence in the schools, that's where the police went. And that was true in Atlanta, it was true in Baltimore. Every major city did not get police in the schools until the 1960s, with one exception, and that was LA. They got it in the 40s, but in response to very similar things, which was the tensions as a result of the migration of Mexican Americans. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because, again, if you look at a city like Detroit, by 2009, there had been 22,000 kids arrested ages 7 to 17, and only 4.3% of all of those kids had committed an aggravated assault. So again, we are arresting kids for the things that kids have always done throughout American history, but we are dealing with it very differently. And we had absorbed the idea that there was something about today's kids that was really, really bad. Today's kids, animals, right? They are really, really different kinds of kids. And of course, not based on any evidence, not based on any science, and certainly not based on the crime rate. As a result of this, very quickly, we had a serious problem, and that was a 38% graduation rate in the city of Detroit. Because one of the things that was very clear was that once you had an in-school suspension, and it was automatically linked with the DA's office, your likelihood of graduating high school went through the toilet. And in fact, your likelihood of going to prison without graduating from high school is exponentially higher. So we had a problem there as well. All right, what does this all mean? Why am I taking the time to tell you all this? Because all of this tore at the social fabric of every poor, marginalized black and brown neighborhood in America, but particularly to the city of Detroit, because it had already been so abandoned by people who were not being policed, namely white folks.